my best job experience. Great colleagues, great students, and great city. So I'm really happy to be back. I'm going to start right away because I am going to fill up about 50 minutes, 50, with my talk, and then I'd like to leave enough time for Q&A. So I'm going to read from my notes because otherwise I wouldn't remember what I'm saying. I spent for that long of a talk. So today I'm going to discuss 3 instances where border controls on human mobility are created and or defended, even by those with putatively progressive politics. The first is anti-trafficking campaigns. I know you can't keep your eyes off this babe up on the screen, but anti-trafficking campaigns. The second is the creation of various temporary foreign migrant worker programs in Canada and the United States. And the third is the increasingly popular idea in Indigenous sovereignty movements and scholarship that all migrants are settler colonists. I argue that each of these discursive practices relies upon and are instances of the expanding reach of border thinking, or in a nod to James Scott, thinking like a state. His book is, of course, Seeing Like a State. While I will discuss each of these separately, the connective threads that tie them together, these different discourses and state policies together, is evident, I believe, when we examine the cultural terrain of nationalism, in which the figure of the migrant, the figure and the state category of the migrant, is vilified, and the process of human mobility is rendered as both out of the ordinary, or a spectacle, as well as a social problem. So, I'm going to get into the situation of anti-trafficking discourse and measures first. Following the Canadian and U.S. government signing of the 2000 United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, with its 2 protocols, one to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, that's actually the title of the protocol, and the other protocol called Against the Smuggling of Migrants, both states, Canada and the U.S., have imposed severe penalties for those convicted of being a human trafficker of persons or a human smuggler of migrants. Tellingly, Canada's first legislative response to signing this convention was implemented not through its criminal code, but through immigration law. Section 118 of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act of 2002 prescribes a maximum penalty of life imprisonment and a $1 million fine for those convicted of transnational human trafficking. Life imprisonment, as we know, is Canada's severest penalty. Similar measures have been undertaken in the United States. There, however, a conviction on trafficking can result in the death penalty for those convicted of causing migrants' deaths. To understand the broad basis of support for anti-trafficking measures, I want to draw attention to the wording of the 2 UN protocols against trafficking and smuggling. In the protocol on trafficking, it is persons whose trafficking states must prevent, suppress, and punish, especially that of women and children. The protocol on smuggling, on the other hand, is about states taking actions against migrants. Unlike smugglers, then, traffickers are not seen as taking advantage of migrants trying to make clandestine crossings of national borders. Instead, traffickers are represented as ruthless outlaws who forcibly move people across national borders or lure them into crossing with lavish promises of the good life. This constructs the putative victims of trafficking as non-migrants, even though the crossing of borders is central to the anti-trafficking discourse. Indeed, within anti-trafficking discourse, migration is portrayed as the cause of exploitation. This, along with the special attention drawn to women and children in the language of the United Nations Protocol Against Trafficking, means that the solution to the problem of trafficking is to send women back home, where they are presumed to be better off. And indeed, deportation is the main policy response in both Canada and the United States. These acts of deportation thus come to be imbued with the moral authority of helping a victim. By characterizing deportation as persons merely going home, it is represented as something that caring people would naturally demand. Anti-trafficking thus comes to be seen as a humanitarian effort at border control. So I'm show these slides of anti-trafficking posters that I just very quickly picked up off the internet a few days ago. And that anti-trafficking measures are rationalized through the discourse of rescue is evidenced by the centrality of terms like modern-day slavery, and in particular sex slavery, and the prevalence of images of women and children being violently and coercively recruited into the sex industry. Tropes of force, victimization, and modern slavery create a sense that the societies that pass anti-trafficking legislation value the lives of migrants and value their freedom. Anti-trafficking measures gain support through the portrayal of victims as helpless, even hapless, thus calling on us to act for these victims. The victims are represented as being without agency, while the agency of their rescuers is augmented by their ability to act to save them. In particular, because victims are for the most part represented as foreigners, it is the national subject who is empowered to act. I'm going to turn this off now because, well, I'll just leave it on. It'll go off by itself. Because I'm going to now quickly move into the situation of migrant workers. While there is a great deal of attention on victims of trafficking, scant attention is paid to temporary foreign workers. This despite the fact that in Canada, the largest category of legal entry and residence is that of temporary foreign worker. And as I showed in my book, Home Economics, it has been the largest category since the mid-1970s. In some years, the numbers of people admitted as temporary foreign workers exceeds the sum total of all other categories of legal migration combined. Currently, in any given year, there are over 300,000 persons recruited and categorized as temporary foreign workers here. This represents about 75 to 80% of all persons admitted specifically to work in Canada. The vast majority of temporary foreign workers, this is a state category, it's in scare quotes, are unable to adjust their status from temporary foreign worker to permanent resident, i.e. immigrant. Being an immigrant means that you've been given the rights of permanent residency. The reason that it is surprising that these hundreds of thousands of people are not taken up by anti-trafficking measures is that most of these workers are tied to their employers and as a result to their specific geographical location as a condition of their entry and continued residence in Canada. They are, in other words, unfree. If dissatisfied with a particular job, occupation, or geographical location, for instance, when the wages one is paid are poor or not forthcoming, when there are better jobs elsewhere, when the working conditions or housing conditions are substandard or even dangerous, when the employer does not fulfill his or her part of the labor contract, or even when the employer is being physically, psychologically, and or sexually abusive, temporary foreign workers cannot, for the most part, leave their employment to seek another job without the written permission of an immigration officer. If that permission is denied, temporary foreign workers are subject to deportation. Thus, temporary foreign workers not only risk losing their job, they also risk losing their legal standing in Canada if they try to change employers or they're unable to keep their employers happy. This augments their sense of captivity. Aside from being tied to their employer, some temporary foreign workers face even further restrictions on their freedom and mobility within Canada, like those regulated by the Live-In Caregiver Program, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, or the even more restrictive low-skilled pilot project introduced in 2002. The Live-In Caregiver Program legally requires temporary foreign workers to live in the same residence as their employer. Well-documented cases of abuse have arisen precisely from this stipulation. People regulated by the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program often have curfews imposed upon them, requiring them to be in their employer-designated housing by a certain time of day. They are prohibited from receiving visitors of the opposite sex, and women workers are often fired if they become pregnant. This is all possible because the Canadian state provides no protection against wrongful dismissal for temporary foreign workers. Ostensibly, the Canadian state at the federal level claims to monitor foreign temporary workers' contracts to ensure that employers are in compliance. However, studies have shown that migrant workers experience very little in the way of assistance from the state, in part because of jurisdictional battles between federal and provincial levels of government. In the case of those employed through the low-skilled pilot project, part of the stipulations of the labor contract drawn up by employers with the assistance of the International Organization for Migration, and which workers must sign in order to reside and work in Canada, is the agreement to avoid joining any group or association, not show any signs of what the employer considers disrespect, and not engage in sexual relations. The contract even contains a clause regarding the length of a worker's hair. The situation for migrant workers in the United States is somewhat different. There, the largest state category of immigration is that of illegal. The number of people classified as illegal by the U.S. state exceeds the total number of all categories of legal migration combined. However, in regards to legal migration, there are striking similarities to Canadian immigration policy. The largest category of work-specific immigration or migration to the United States is that of guest workers. That's a state category. The numbers show that in 2003, only about 82,000 persons were granted employment-based green cards, permanent residency visas, while about 360,000 persons came as guest workers. In other words, over 4 times as many persons legally granted permission to work in the United States were given the status of guest worker as were given the status and rights of permanent residency. As with Canada's Temporary Foreign Workers Program, guest workers in the U.S. are tied to their employers as a condition of legal entry and continued legal residence in the U.S. And as in Canada, the vast majority cannot alter their status to gain permanent residency. In the United States, the category of guest workers is set to become much, much larger as both the Democratic and Republican Party policy platforms on immigration reform share the view that any regularization of illegals would involve transferring people from the state category of illegal to that of guest worker. In Canada, the category of temporary foreign workers is expanding yearly, as we know. Support for various migrant workers programs stems from a common sense understanding that at the end of the day, migrant workers are lucky to work in Canada or the United States and are especially lucky to work with a legal status. The fact that the dominant image of migrant workers is that of people racialized as not white from the global south facilitates this idea. As Sadef Arat-Koch argues, the act of allowing them into the country, even under the strictures of various temporary foreign worker schemes, is seen as an act of charity extended by Canadian and American nationals to foreign others. The supposed good luck of temporary foreign workers to work is related to the idea that jobs in any national space are ultimately for nationals, and that it is the national state's responsibility and duty to ensure that things remain this way. It is for this reason that the common sense image of migrant workers is that of someone doing work that nationals just don't want to do. Notably, then, amongst the few times that the employment of temporary foreign workers becomes political is when workers, again usually not white, are employed in normatively high-skilled, good jobs. For instance, in the controversy over employing temporary foreign workers from China for a mine projected to open in British Columbia, Mark Olson, the president of the Bargaining Council of BC Building Trade Unions, argued a few days ago that Canadian workers should get preference for any new mining jobs in BC and that the miners from China already in BC should be sent home. In this vein, officials of District 3 of the United Steelworkers have put out a leaflet with the same message. Titled, BC Jobs for BC Workers, it proclaims, quote, "Stop the sellout of our province," unquote. This is what makes the various temporary foreign workers or guest workers unpolitical. The hegemony of national consciousness ensures that the substandard treatment of the imagined community of foreigners is always already legitimate, even required. This is why migrant workers are lucky to be here. This is also why I think there is a relative silence on the terms of various temporary foreign worker programs, especially in comparison to the enormous amount of attention, largely negative, given to immigrants, i.e. those who enter, live, and work in Canada with the rights of permanent residency and have a path to citizenship. I'm now going to move on rapidly to the topic of Indigenous nationalisms. I know this is a crazy talk. I'm now going to move on to the topic of Indigenous nationalisms and the conflation between migration and colonialism found in many versions of them. And then I'm going to try and make a connection between all three of these: trafficking, temporary foreign workers, and Indigenous sovereignty movements. The idea that all migrants are settler colonists has been advanced in a number of recent scholarly works in Canada and the United States. But lest we see this as merely an academic exercise, it is important to note that it is a political discourse evident throughout the world, including in diverse sites and with very diverse political perspectives on every continent and on the Sea of Islands. While it is more or less intense in various places, it informs anti-immigrant politics, for example, throughout Europe, most obviously in the far-right parties, but arguably across the political spectrum. It has also informed the expulsions of those cast as non-natives, as with the expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972. It has informed military coups d'etats in Fiji in the 1980s, in genocidal practices in Rwanda in the 1990s, as Mahmoud Mamdani has clearly shown, and as he has also argued, it is evident in calls for Western-led military intervention today in Darfur. It is also apparent in an increasingly popular political claim in the historic white settler colonies of the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, where the distinction between processes of migration and processes of colonization are being collapsed into one another. I'll spend a little bit more outlining this particular instance of what I think is border thinking, as it's received relatively much less attention by border studies scholars. In a special issue of the journal called Amerasia, entitled Whose Vision? Asian Settler Colonialism in Hawaii, various essayists claim that Asians in Hawaii are settler colonists and are active in the colonization of native Hawaiians. These Asian settler colonists are, for the most part, United States citizens descendant from indentured plantation workers from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines who began arriving in the mid-1800s. These arguments are repeated by Benita Lawrence and Ina Dua in their 2005 journal article in the journal Social Justice. For them, all non-Indigenous people in Canada are settlers who are, quote, part of the ongoing project of colonization, unquote. Like the contributors to that Amerasia issue on Hawaii, Lawrence and Dua also focus on non-whites. They state, quote, people of color are settlers. Broad differences exist between those brought as slaves, currently working as migrant laborers, are refugees without legal documentation, or emigres who have obtained citizenship. Yet people of color live on land that is appropriated and contested, where Aboriginal peoples are denied nationhood and access to their own lands. Each of these are instances of autochthonous discourses, a discourse that posits the theoretical and political centrality of nativeness, and a discourse that argues for a particular kind of politics, that of native nationalisms. For Haunani K. Trask, a self-described Hawaiian nationalist, native struggles are conceived of as, quote, but the latest stage in the revolutionary era that advanced the freedom of African, Latin American, and Asian peoples, unquote. Likewise, Lawrence and Dua insist that Indigenous people in Canada must, quote, regenerate nationhood, unquote, to realize decolonization, for, quote, at the heart of Indigenous people's realities is nationhood, unquote. As in other nationalist movements, from below or from above, with their always already limited sense of who can belong, autochthonous arguments for national liberation that center indigeneity require a unified, homogeneous nation that is set against its others. This is where the figure of the migrant comes in. The quintessential non-native is the migrant. Candace Fujikane, in hierarchically ranking the claims to belonging in what is now the United States, puts it this way, quote, Indigenous people are differentiated from settlers by their genealogical, familial relationship with specific land bases that are ancestors to them. One is either indigenous to a particular land base or one is not. Asian Americans, which is whom she's writing about, Asian Americans are undeniably settlers in the United States because we cannot claim any genealogy to the land we occupy, no matter how many lifetimes Asian settlers work on the land or how many Asian migrants have been killed through racist persecution and hate crimes, or how brutal the political or colonial regimes that occasioned Asians' exodus from their homelands, unquote. In such autochthonous discourse, only natives are the nation's subjects, and only the nation's subjects are legitimate agents in its self-determination. Historian Patrick Wolfe, a historian of Australia, makes an increasingly typical statement in this regard when he says, quote, the fundamental social divide is not the color line. It is not ethnicity, minority status, or even class. The primary line is the one distinguishing natives from settlers, that is, from everyone else. Only the native is not a settler. Only the native is truly local. Only the native will free the native. One is either native or not, unquote. The autochthonous project is often not only a nationalist one, i.e. Trying to stake out claims of being a nation, but also a statist one. Haunani-Kay Trask, in her article entitled Settlers of Color and Immigrant Hegemony in Hawaii, advocates an explicitly statist, even neoliberal vision of a decolonized Hawaiian nation. She states, quote, once Hawaiians reclaim these lands, public and private relationships between natives and non-natives will be altered. For example, settlers will have to pay taxes or user fees to swim at native-owned beaches, enjoy recreation at native-owned parks, drive on native-owned roads, fly out of native-owned airports, educate their children at public schools on native-owned lands, and on and on. Above all, non-natives will have to live alongside a native political system that has statutory authority to exclude, tax, or otherwise regulate the presence of non-natives on native lands. The potential shift here frightens non-natives because it signals the political and economic ascendancy of natives. At the least, native power means no more free access by non-natives to native resources, unquote. Significantly, many Indigenous scholars cite Article 1 of the United Nations Charter as the basis for the existence of this sharp distinction between natives and migrants. This charter, they argue, grants natives, because they are a people, i.e. a nation, since not all people are a people, the same international right accrued to other nations to exclusively determine their membership. The right of national sovereignty allows for the state's regulation of people's movement in and across nationally defined territories, as well as the organization of hierarchically organized difference within the nationalized polity, differences in this case between natives and non-natives. And so, why is there support for this all natives are colonizers discourse? First, let me acknowledge that such a discourse is not nearly as popular or powerful in either Canada or the United States as the discourse supporting and rationalizing the existence of anti-trafficking legislation or the existence of various temporary foreign workers programs, and it certainly does not constitute Canadian or American state practices. It is instead a discourse of resistance by Indigenous people working within the framework of nationalism and a discourse of their allies. Within such political claims, it is assumed, that allies of Indigenous nationalists must follow the lead established by Indigenous people. So what I'm arguing is that part of the support for this discourse is the claim within the discourse itself that allies of Indigenous nationalists must follow the lead established by Indigenous people. So again, Haunani K. Trask puts it this way, quote, defending Hawaiian sovereignty initiatives is only beneficial for allies when non-natives play the role assigned to them by natives, unquote. Hawaiian poet Imaikalani Kalahele puts it more succinctly when he says, quote, if to help us is your wish, then stand behind us, not to the side and not in front, unquote. Perhaps because of this restrictive notion of what being an ally means, there has been an almost complete silence about autochthonous discourses within anti-racist and migrant justice movements in Canada and the United States. The relative silence may also be due to the fact that anti-racist organizing and scholarship has itself been deemed to be a colonizing discourse by some Indigenous scholars and their allies. Lawrence and Dua, for instance, claim that anti-racist theory and practice has historically excluded Aboriginal people's perspectives. The result, they claim, is twofold. Aboriginal people, quote, cannot see themselves in anti-racism contexts, and Aboriginal activism against settler domination takes place without people of color as allies, unquote. Moreover, as anti-racist demands are said to only ever fall into a civil rights framework, Lawrence and Dua argue that, quote, anti-racism is premised on an ongoing colonial project, unquote, and on, quote, a colonizing social formation, unquote. Hence, for them, anti-racist praxis, quote, contributes to the active colonization of Indigenous peoples. So now I'm going to shift to trying to make some connections between these disparate discourses and practices right after this. Anti-trafficking campaigns and legislation, various migrant worker programs, and the discourse of autochthony are not as seemingly separate as they may appear. Each of these discourses calls upon us to, quote, think like a state. And what I mean by this is that each assumes that space is in fact national. That is, that each space belongs to the national subjects of whichever nation has the greatest claim to it. Each of them also assumes the authority to determine who lives where and under what conditions. Each accepts what I think is a highly patriarchal notion of an all-knowing, all-powerful state that can mandate reality through its law, i.e., if the nation-state doesn't want people to move, they will not move. Or if the nation-state and nationalists determine that some people don't belong, then they don't. In this way, each accepts the process of border controls and the associated categorization practices of national states that distinguish between citizens and non-citizens, between permanents and temporaries, between legals and illegals, and increasingly between natives and non-natives. Each further accepts that these legal distinctions are somehow reflective of a deeper, even natural reality, that there can be, maybe there even should be, people who live, work, and even die within the same space that national subjects occupy, but who will always remain foreign to society. In the case of anti-trafficking practices, the national state has a right, even a duty, to crack down on those who move people across national borders without official permission. In the case of various migrant worker programs, the state has the right, even moral duty, according to the steelworkers, to treat those who can be classified as foreigners differently and substandardly from those classified as citizens or even permanent residents. In the case of autochthonous discourses, only native nations and national subjects have the moral and material authority to determine what happens in that space and who belongs. Now I'm going to try and shift a little bit more to the deeper analysis of the connections between anti-trafficking measures and migrant workers programs. It's because anti-trafficking campaigns and measures are a form of border control that very few anti-trafficking reformers address the barriers that states put into place against safe migration and against migrants' access to rights. Even more to the point, anti-trafficking reforms wholly ignore state practices that legislate conditions of unfreedom, coercion, and exploitation for certain migrants, conditions that they face that are not unlike those described by anti-trafficking crusaders for victims of trafficking. For anti-trafficking crusaders, and of course for the states that legislate migrant workers into being, foreign temporary workers only become victims if they are made to work for an employer they were not assigned to by the state, or if they were to move into the category of illegal worker, or if they can make claims to having been deceived by recruitment agents promising them access to a permanent residency status. If you were promised permanent residency and then you find out that this was a lie, then you can take advantage of anti-trafficking legislation to try and claim to have been victimized by traffickers. However, if you knowingly signed a contract to become a temporary foreign worker and you were aware of the limits of your labor market and geographical mobility, then within the framework of anti-trafficking, no harm has been done to you. In other words, the rules of the various temporary foreign worker schemes are about national states' sovereign right to determine membership, to distinguish between national subjects and foreigners, and to establish a policy on human migration. The lack of outcry over the treatment of persons recruited as temporary foreign guest workers by employers or by the state shows some striking similarities to the politics of human mobility during the centuries-long period of the African slave trade. Just as there were no complaints ever about there being too many slaves when the African slave trade was central to the U.S. economy and polity, there are today no complaints about there being too many persons categorized as temporary foreign workers, except perhaps when they try and when they are employed in jobs that are seen as high-skilled, good jobs, which is increasingly so. Quite the opposite. As they did during slavery, employers and state officials regularly complain that there are not enough temporary foreign workers. Historically, in both Canada and the U.S., the refrain that there are too many people from this or that negatively racialized group stems from their holding, or the possibility of their holding, permanent residency rights and citizenship status. In other words, there are only too many migrants when they have too many rights. In the absence of such rights, there can never be enough. In this, we need to attend to the work that the employment contract does in the creation of legitimacy for conditions of unfreedom. When doing so, we find that the politicization of human trafficking and the related depoliticization of temporary foreign workers programs is not only linked to the politics of human mobility during the period of the slave trade, i.e., there can never be too many unfree workers, but it's also linked to the abolition of the slave trade, 1807 in the British Empire, 1808 in the United States, and to the abolition of slave labor relations themselves, 1833 in Canada, 1865 in the United States. With the formal abolition of the slave trade and slave labor relations, the global mobility of labor did not become any less important in either Canada or the United States. The central issue for states and for employers was the issue of the rights of those who would be recruited to replace slaves. The solution to the problem of the end of slavery was the coolie, quote unquote. Coolie is obviously a racist epithet, but that's what it was known as. The solution to the problem of the end of slavery was the coolie system of labor recruitment, that is, the system of recruiting people primarily from China and India to work in conditions of indentured servitude. In Canada and the U.S., statutes were put into place that indentured coolies to their employers through ostensibly time-limited contracts. The coolie labor system became one of the main ways that states regulated the international movement of workers from the time that slave labor relations were abolished throughout the British Empire in the 1830s to about 1920. The delegitimization of slavery that the abolitionist movement successfully organized meant that coolies had to be imagined as voluntary and their labor to be imagined as free. And labor contracts did the trick, even for some in the slavery abolition movement who did not fight for the abolition of indentured servitude. This despite the fact that coolies, as Lisa Lowe puts it, would be shipped on the same vessels that had brought the slaves they were designed to replace. Some would fall to disease, die, suffer abuse and mutiny, and that those who survived the 3-month voyage would encounter coercive, confined conditions upon arrival. The duration of a contract was typically 5 to 8 years, but many coolies did not live out their terms of service because of the harsh labor conditions and because of mistreatment. Those who did survive were often forced through a variety of means to remain in servitude beyond the initial contracted period. Many coolies were deceived or kidnapped and then kept in detention centers or loading vessels in the points of departure. Not only were conditions inhumane and dangerous in this Pacific Passage, mortality rates at the places they were employed was also very high, 75% in some cases, 100% in some others. Yet coolies were imagined as free. The political discourse of indentured labor as a form of free migration took shelter in labor contracts which reproduced the notion inherent in all ideas of contract, that both parties to it have entered into it voluntarily. The signing of labor contracts, often written in English by coolie laborers who were often illiterate, was the documentary proof used to present this system as being absent of any coercion. Crucially, while labor contracts were entered into by employers and the workers, it was the state's power over immigration and citizenship that was central to ensuring the viability and the legitimacy of the coolie labor system. The end of the slave trade, and more significantly, the end of slave labor relations, was followed by the enactment of the very first immigration regulations in Canada and the United States. Indeed, it was only after the slave trade ended that passports were developed. It is also in the aftermath of slavery and the implementation of the coolie labor system that the contemporary racialization of immigration controls arose in Canada and the U.S. Examples include the U.S. government's Page Law of 1875, its Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and in Canada, the 1885 Chinese head tax legislation. It's also evident in the area of citizenship. Although birthright citizenship for all persons was formally recognized in the United States after 1868 with the adoption of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, citizenship criteria continued to prohibit certain negatively racialized groups from naturalizing. Asians were unable to naturalize as U.S. or Canadian citizens until after World War II. These citizenship restrictions were a key mechanism of limiting the freedom of coolies who had fulfilled the terms of their labor contract. It is in this context that immigration and citizenship become key technologies of what, after Foucault, we can call a modern racial governmentality. This is because racialized immigration and citizenship policies worked to create legislated distinctions between those who could be tied to their employers and those who could not. As it was for a large part of the slave trade, contract labor too came to be racialized, this time as predominantly Asian. Not coincidentally, I believe, this was also the time of the 19th century moral panic about the white slave trade in women, purportedly organized by and for the benefit of Asian men. The first, of course, of the moral panics around human trafficking. It is within this muddled mess that a discourse emerged which assumed, and still assumes, that international migration is driven by individuals making rational and calculating choices to maximize the best return for their human capital. With freedom being so defined, the social, political, and economic conditions leading to and constituting the experience of migration were mystified. What was also mystified was the importance of migration to the world capitalist system. We were left with the myth of self-contained and self-sufficient national societies which, in a nod to Foucault, must be defended against foreigners. Rational and putatively free migrants were regulated by rational and putatively sovereign states. Indeed, states' regulation of Indeed, states' regulation of migration was a key aspect of what rendered them as both rational and sovereign. Within this system, it is simply legal and socially legitimate to make unfree those placed within state categories of temporary foreign worker. As with the coolie labor system, the only ones responsible for this state of affairs are the migrants themselves, since they chose to agree to sign the terms of their employment contracts. In the process, national states and capital are given a free pass. Unofficial movement across national borders, for instance, a woman paying someone to get her across a national border and find her a job, is an aberration and a problem for society. Recall, anti-trafficking legislation is to protect persons from traffickers, while anti-smuggling legislation is to protect national subjects from migrants willfully ignoring the state's prohibition on their movement. By vilifying the trafficker, anti-trafficking measures depoliticize state immigration policies. To clarify, I am not calling for the extension of the label of trafficking to state-organized schemes of unfree migrant workers, as some are. I am instead in favor of the elimination of national state controls on people's movement across space. I point to these programs, temporary foreign workers programs, to show that the reason that the discursive practice of anti-trafficking is wholly unconcerned with state-organized programs of unfreedom is their acceptance of the legitimacy of national immigration regimes and their lack of concern with the gross disparities and exploitation organized by capitalist social relations, relations of which migration has always been and remains an integral part. Okay, so what does Indigenous nationalisms and demands for Indigenous sovereignty have to do with this? Well, to begin with, I believe that collapsing the process of human migration into the process of colonization represents a failure to recognize the significance of territorializing one's access to the stuff of life. From a territorialized perspective of land and belonging, being native is both spatially and temporally dependent. In a discourse of autochthony, while migrants may be identified as native at some point in time and in some given space, once having moved away from the spaces where such identities may be claimed, they become non-natives in the places that they move to. So I'm a native of India, I'm a non-native of Canada, or of Indigenous territories in Canada. Moreover, within autochthonous discourses in Canada and the United States, claims to nativeness require more than a birth in a given space. They require a lineage traceable to the claimed first inhabitants. As a result, dominant understandings of nativeness become racialized or ethnicized. This racialization of belonging is dependent upon nationalist ideas of primordial homelands. In the same vein, migrants always remain natives, but only to the places that they don't actually live or work in. Thus, some argue that migrants can continue to claim native rights to places they have moved away from if they are able to show descendancy from those claiming to be the original human inhabitants of any space. In this way, a migrant only has rights in the place that she no longer resides in, and has none, or at least lesser rights, in the places that she actually does. Collapsing the process of human migration into the process of colonization, therefore, represents a failure to recognize that migration is an often used strategy to escape colonialism and other forms of subjugation, destitution, and death. Far from being incomprehensible and irrational, however, such moves towards autochthony are deeply embedded within the processes of capitalist globalization themselves. Just as migrant is a state category, so of course is native. Hence, it is not a coincidence that the expansion of the category of settler or colonizer to include all non-natives really took off in the late 1980s when the discursive practices of neoliberalism became hegemonic. And in this section, I'd really like to acknowledge the work of Cynthia Wright, who I've worked with on this issue. Problematizing the presence of those who don't belong, along with calls for people to stay fixed in their space, have gained legitimacy precisely as capital, commodities, ideas, and people have become increasingly mobile, and as there have been reductions in the material benefits of citizenship resulting from neoliberal reforms. In this way, native identities have become possessive identities, since making claims as natives is often the only avenue within existing systems to lay claim to resources, especially the resource of land. In this regard, it is mainly a possessive identity of the poor and the dispossessed, since the rich have other, more market and law-based means by which to gain land and other resources. Processes of neoliberalism have exacerbated this process as access to needed resources has become even more diminished by the further entrenchment of market relationships. In the context of the global system of national states, to gain access to land, it must be territorialized. Making claims on the basis of nativeness can be seen as a part of the expansion and intensification of the process of territorialization, and certainly of border politics. So to conclude, where, when, who, what is the border? And in this very brief section, I want to give a nod out as well to Cynthia Wright and another of our colleague, Bridget Anderson. We co-edited a special issue of the journal Refuge on No Borders as Practical Politics, in which we discuss where, who, when, what is the border. So to conclude, it is important to recognize that any study of national borders needs to start with the recognition that borders are thoroughly ideological. They don't stop human mobility, and they're not meant to. That's not their point. Far from being about keeping people out, border controls are attempts to create certain types of subjects and subjectivities. Borders are the mark of a particular kind of relationship between people, one based on deep divisions and inequalities between people given varying national statuses and national subjectivities. It is important to recognize that this has far-reaching implications and is not simply restricted to the event of crossing a territorial border. The relationship between the generation of national subjects and national subjectivities calls upon us to think like a state. We uphold space itself as a nation, thereby empowering those who can successfully present themselves as national subjects. We think this national authority is supreme, that the nation's others will acquiesce, and we accept the great and growing disparities that border controls do, so much that a practice seen manifestly unjust for nationals is seen as perfectly legitimate, even morally desirable for those categorized as the nation's others or foreigners. So, thank you.